Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 9 major Kenyan communities that had their names changed after independence. Sometimes we assume that the names we know the Kenyan communities by today have always been the same names. Actually, they have not. Most of the Kenyan communities today are known by names that they were given much later. And some of them have changed names several times. And I remember I did a video where I discussed that what names communities carry. These are names that often a community will have more than one name that it goes by, and it's because there was a name that they called themselves, and then there was a name that another neighbor called them, and another neighbor had a different name. So you will have, like, if a community has 5 neighbors, each of these 5 neighbors has a different name for them, and they also have their own name. So when the British came, they were trying to find names for each of these communities, and often they will pick a name that they are told by one of the neighbors they approach the first, and that's the name they will put down, that these people are called that name. And what the British didn't know, that there was so much dislike amongst the different groups, and often the names that they chose to call one another were not good names. They were derogatory names, and they were names that had very terrible meanings. But the British didn't know that, so they just put down the names. And then when Kenya was approaching independence, or after independence, of course, people from these different groups realized that in the official records, their communities were called very negative, or names that had very negative meanings. And so there was kind of like lobbying, and then some of these names had to be changed. Now, let's look at some of them. I'm going to start from the coast. At the coast, there is a people, or a group of communities, actually. It wasn't one community. The Duruma, the Digo, all these groups that are found just at the coast or near the coast, they used to be called the Wanyika. Now, the name Wanyika has a meaning of people of the wild, or the uncivilized ones. And this is a name that these people were given, or this is a name that the Swahilis gave these people. And so when the Europeans came, if you read very old documents, you realize that those people are recorded as Wanyika. But then later on, as Kenya became independent, or after or before, there was lobbying, and then those groups had the name changed from Wanyika, and they became Mijikenda. Now, I remember I did a video where I say that some of these names were created very recently, and I did mention Mijikenda is one of those names. So they moved from being called Wanyika to being called Mijikenda, which means 9 villages, or 9, because it's like 9 smaller groups that came together to form one large community. Now, the next one is the name for the Oromo people. Now, Oromo is a huge community. These are people found in Ethiopia, they are found in Kenya, and to some extent they are found in Somalia. Some people disagree that there are any Oromo in Somalia. But I've tried to read different sources. They say there is a very small minority of Oromo people in Somalia. Or there used to be up until very recently, maybe in the 1990s, and then they moved out. Now, the Oromo people used to go, if you read very old texts, maybe not very old, even texts written in 1940s, 1930s, they are referred to as the Galla people. Now, and I need to point something out about these names. And I think I've made it, I've already kind of like mentioned it. And these are names that, of course, came from other people, not the names the people themselves called themselves. And in English, such names are called exonyms. These are names that other people choose to call a community. So Galla is one such exonym. It's a name that other people chose to call this group of people. But the Oromo themselves have called themselves Orma or Oromo for thousands or years, probably. So the meaning of this word is hard to get, but there is a talk that it means the wild ones, the rough ones, the pagan, the milk people. Like, it depends who you talk to. For example, when you talk to maybe the Amhara, they will tell you that the name means the wild or the rough ones. When you talk to the Somalis, they will tell you that it means the pagans, because maybe some of them did not convert to Islam, even though today most Oromos, a huge chunk of Oromos are Muslims. And then there is the milk, which comes from maybe some European interpretation that it is a name that comes from Hebrew languages, something of sort. So, but anyways, the Oromo people don't, like most of these other people, they don't approve of that name, because there is a name they call themselves, or they've always called themselves. So, of course, when they Of course, the Africans were getting a lot more say when it came to making public records. Of course, the Oromo people kind of like lobbied, and that name has been dropped to a large extent. So you can only find it in very old documents. Now, another group of people, now this is a little bit, I can say, controversial, is the Maasai. And it is controversial not for a really bad reason. It's controversial because of what does it really mean, or whether are we speaking of the same people or we are speaking of other people, because the Maa speaking group has been a large group in East Africa, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, and to some extent maybe we can say Ethiopia. The Maa speaking people have covered a huge chunk of what we know today as Kenya, and they were in very different subgroups, and they occupy different places, and in different places they were called different names. There were the Wasingishu, there were the Samburu, there are of course the Maasai, the Puruk, all these groups. Now here is the thing with the Maasai: if you go read all documents, you'll find them or described, or maybe given the name of Kwafi. But you read other old documents, then it is said that the Kwafi were a completely different group of people and not the Maasai. So that remains to be a topic that is kind of emotive. There is no conclusion of who were the Kwafi. The Kwafi were the Kwafi, the Maasai. Because if you read a document, for example, written by one Craft, he discusses or he talks of the Kwafi as a different group of people, and the Maasai is another group of people. But other documents will use the name Kwafi for the Maasai. Now, the name itself, Kwafi, according to Craft, is a name that is a corruption of the word Eloikob. Now, this, unlike the others, at least the foundational or the origin of the word itself is not from other people, it's from the people themselves. The people used to call themselves the Eloikob, which means the people of the land. But then now where it comes, the name Kwafi comes from, at least according to Ludwig Kraft, is that this is a name that came as a corruption of the word Eloikob, especially by the Kamba people. The Kamba people, for some reason, could not pronounce the word Eloikob, and then they called them Kwafi. And when the Europeans came, of course, they speak to the Kamba. What is the name of those people? They tell them they are called Kwafi. The Europeans write down Kwafi. And that name stuck for some time, and in very many official documents, very many books, that's the name that was used. But the name itself has been dropped. Of course, Maasai is the name that has been used for the most part, but of course there is that discussion of whether when we say Kwafi, are we talking of the Maasai or we are talking of another group that was annihilated basically by the Maasai. Now, another group of people that had their name changed is the Kipsigis. Now, the Kipsigis used to be called Lumbwa, and if you read many of the old texts, that's the name you will come across, Lumbwa here, Lumbwa there. The name itself, of course, like many of these other names, has come to be considered to be insulting. So after independence, the name was dropped, and it stopped appearing in official documents. And of course, generally, people stop referring to the Kipsigis as Lumbwa. But if you go into some villages in Maasai land, for example, they still call them Lumbwa. If you go to Kisii land, they still call them Lumbwa. So in these other communities, the name is still in use, but of course you can't find it in official documents. Now, the name, it's not known well where the name came from, but one theory is that the name originated from the Maasai, and the Maasai is called the Kipsigis Lumbwa because the Kipsigis were doing farming, they were digging the ground. And remember that among the Maasai, and this is something that is also explained by Ludwig Kraft, in his book where he discusses the Kwafi people, is that digging the ground for food was considered to be like is the lowest a human being can go to. Like that's not people with their own respect will do. So the Maasai and the Kwafi, seeing other people doing farming, to them that was so disgusting, basically. They could not think of why a human being should bring themselves to digging the ground. So when they called the Kipsigis Lumbwa, at least going by one theory, it was like insulting them for what they do to get food. So they called them Lumbwa. And the staff say that's a name that is no longer used, and it's a name that was dropped mostly after or just before, immediately after independence. There was, of course, some lobbying and the name was dropped. Now, the other one is the Kisii people. Now, if you read old texts, and I remember I'm still reading the text East Africa Protectorate by Sir Charles Eliot, and I also saw this in a book written or a document written by one Hobley. They don't use the name Kisii. Kisii is a very recent name for the people we know today as Abagusi or Kisii people. the name you'll find in most or many of the old texts is Kosova. Now, Kosova, if you go to among the Kipsigis, they still call them Kosova actually. So some of these, especially I've seen this word used among the Kipsigis, I've not seen it used by other people. Of course, the Kipsigis are their neighbors. So Kosova is the word you'll find. And if you read an old text and you come across that word, it means the people of Kisii. So the name Kosova is hard to tell what it means or where it came from. I was trying to look around. I could not find a document or a source that can say, at least give a theory of what the name means or where it came from. We don't know who gave them the name, but like most of these other names, likely this is a name that was given to them by other groups of people. Now, the other one is the Luo and the Luhya. Now, this is very interesting, and I've always wondered why, because the Luos are Nilotic speaking people, the Luhya are Bantu speaking people. But when you read all documents, these people are put together and there is a name that is used for them. And I've always found that to be so interesting, and I've always been confused as what was happening there. And the name I'm talking about is Kavirondo. If you read all documents, you'll find the Kavirondo, the Nilotic Kavirondo, which means Luo, the Bantu speaking Kavirondo, which means the groups we know today as the Luhya group. And I've been wondering, where did that name come from? Because like history doesn't tell us that these people came from the same place. Of course, there is a possibility that they do share some genetics. But the point is, how did it come that they are given the same name or one name? Now, I was doing some digging and I come to realize, like most of these other names, this is a name that was given by other people to these groups of people. And apparently the name, there are two theories. One theory says that the name came from the Swahili traders. And the Swahili traders started calling people who lived around what is known as Winam Gulf, around Kisumu and that region. They started calling them that Kavirondo, and it's because there was a habit of the people around that region. When they sit down, they sit on their heels. And this is a habit that is in very many Kenyan communities. If you go into the very rural Kenya and you find people who have not changed so much, you realize that when people sit down, they sit on their heels. And apparently the Swahilis used to see that habit a lot among the Luhya and the Luo people around Winam Gulf, and they decided to call them the people of Kavirondo. Now, that's one theory. The other theory is that this is a Luhya name, or maybe Maragoli or something like that, and it's Kamrondo, which means round, and which is like it is referring to the Winam Gulf, something of sort. So there are those two theories of where Kavirondo comes from. But of course, like most of these other names, these are names that came from outsiders, most likely the Swahili traders. And when the Europeans or the British came and they were creating some documents, they decided to write them down as Kavirondo people, and they decided to call the Luhya the Bantu Kavirondo and the Luo the Nilotic Kavirondo, even though the Luos were calling themselves Joluo. And then when you go to the Luhya side, it's a little bit more complex, because different groups among the Luhya did not even consider themselves to be the same group. The different groups had their different names, like Maragoli and all these other groups. Now, number 7 is the Bukusu people. Now, the Bukusu, of course, today we consider them to be part of the Luhya group. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And the Bukusu have called themselves Bukusu all along. But if you read all documents, they are not called Bukusu, they are called other names. And the names I've come across mostly is Kitosh, and the other name is Masawa or Masaba. Now, there is also Kisu or Ngisu, which is Bagisu, of course, and Bagisu in Uganda is more or less the same people as Bukusu of Kenya. They share a lot language and tradition and culture. Now, like most of these other groups, the name Kitosh apparently came from the Maasai. Also Ngisu, which is Bagisu, apparently came from the Maasai. And like most of these other names, of course, it was not a name that meant something good. It had to do with maybe degrading the people in some ways. So when the Europeans come, maybe they ask the Maasai, what is the name of those people? They told them those people are called Kitosh, and the Europeans wrote down Kitosh. As far as Masaba or Masawa, seems like the people themselves did consider or did use that name for themselves. But later on, after independence, the name Bukusu was maybe lobbied to become the official name that is then written in official documents, and today we call them the Bukusu people. Now, another group of people who had their name changed, we can say at independence or just before or after independence, is the Tugen people. Now, the Tugen people, of course, they themselves have called themselves Tugen. We will never know for how long. But that's not what you read in official documents or books that you can read, books written in early 19th century or late 19th century, early 20th century. That's not what you'll find. What you'll find is the name Kamasia. Now, I was trying to find out what the name Kamasia means. It's difficult, but like most of these other names, most likely it's other people who call them Kamasia. Some theory says it comes from the word Kamasi, which is a Kalenjin word for this side. I think that's an overstretch, but there's a possibility. We'll never know for sure where that name came from, but it was changed to Tugen. There is no indication that it was an insulting name, derogatory name. There is no sign of that, but there is a reason why it was changed. There is a reason why it was preferred to call them Tugen. Maybe the only reason is that Tugen is the name they call themselves. Now, the other one is the Pokot people. Now, Pokot, of course, we know today as them as Pokot, but in all documents that you read, they are not called Pokot. They are called Suk people. Now, the Suk people, it's hard to tell where the name Suk came from, but there's a theory that it comes from a type of hoe they used to use to dig or to do agriculture. And it is the Maasai who called them Suk, actually. Now, if you've noticed, the Maasai did name many of these groups, or the Europeans rather, did pick names that the Maasai used to call these people, these other people, and use them as official names. And I think the reason for that is that at some point the Maasai was spread uh, on a large section of what we know today as Kenya. And in fact, it's for the same reason that we have so many places in Kenya called Maasai names, including Nairobi, Naivasha, Nakuru, Laikipia, Limuru, Rumuruti, or such kind of names. They are Maasai names. And I think it's the same reason that the first names that the Europeans recorded or names of the other communities were names that the Maasai supplied them. But anyways, as I've said, many of these names were changed at independence as Kenyans, of course, tried to assert their independence and to claim dignity. And part of that was having the right names appearing in official documents. Those are my random thoughts.